Welcome, everybody. Thanks to those who are with us this morning, and thanks to those of you who may have joined us this afternoon. I am Marcia Inhorn. I'm a professor of anthropology and international affairs here at Yale, and I'm also the outgoing editor of the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. And this, as you may know, is the 10th anniversary celebration of JMUS, the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies. And it is our annual celebration to have a conference of this type with a distinguished lecturer. And I am very delighted that this year's distinguished lecturer is Professor Sondra Hale, because she has been absolutely part and parcel of the development of JMUS, our journal, over the past 10 years. She was co-editor of it, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, but she's been an icon in Middle East and African feminist studies. And so we're just really delighted to have her with us at Yale, which is your first time at Yale, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so welcome to Yale. Sondra, we're going to call you Sondra. She's a close friend to many of us.
Because that's my name.
Right. Instead of Professor Hale. Sondra is research professor and professor emerita of anthropology and women's studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she's had a very long history. She first earned her BA in English literature at UCLA, her MA in African studies at UCLA, and then her PhD in anthropology. After she received her PhD, she taught in a variety of institutions, including the University of Khartoum in Sudan, the California Institute of the Arts, and the California State Universities in both Long Beach and Northridge. But then she returned to UCLA, where she served as professor of anthropology and women's studies before her retirement 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago in 2011. At UCLA, she served in many capacities as chair of women's studies, which is now called gender studies at UCLA. She was the co-chair of Islamic studies, and she was the interim co-director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies. And during her tenure at the university, she helped to co-found the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, or AMUS, which is the parent organization of JMUS. And then exactly a decade ago, she and a small group of feminist women really wrote the proposal to get JMUS off the ground. So she's just been absolutely a critical player in the development of the association and the journal. In terms of her research, Sondra is a well-known scholar of Africa and the Middle East. She focuses mainly on the Sudan and Eritrea. And she's the author of, I think, what we could call one of our classic feminist ethnographies called Gender Politics in Sudan, Islamism, Socialism, and the State, which was first published in 1996 by Westview Press, which was later translated into Arabic in 2011, and which, in my view, provides really one of the best analyses of the competing voices at play in the sort of development and continuance of the Sudanese feminist movement. In addition, Sondra has published over the years many articles and book chapters on the topics of gender, war, conflict, and genocide, international gender studies, including issues of gender and citizenship, diaspora studies and cultural studies, and social movements, including boycotts surrounding issues of academic freedom. Her co-edited volume, called Sudan's Killing Fields, is going to be coming out this year. And Sondra also writes about feminist art. I know that you liked the presentation this morning on feminist art. And she has recently published a co-edited volume with Terry Wolverton called From Sight to Vision, The Woman's Building in Contemporary Culture, published in 2011, and it focuses on feminist art in the Los Angeles area. Beyond her many academic contributions, I will throw in there that Sondra is a talented ventriloquist, but
Watch out.
but she's also a well-known activist, both domestically and internationally. On the domestic front, she's carried out activism on the various campuses where she's taught, including in the classrooms where she's introduced new and controversial ideas of many kinds. She's taken her graduate students with her into protest movements. She's a really exemplary feminist activist for the young women who she has trained over the years. Sondra is the founder and coordinator of California Scholars for Academic Freedom, which is a coalition of nearly 200 academics from 20 institutions of higher education in California. And she's been active for decades in the civil rights movement, in anti-war movements, and in feminist and people of color movements. Her activism against racism has really been a significant component of her life. And she told me anecdotally that her mom in Des Moines, Iowa, where she grew up, kind of in a poorer part of the city, was very concerned that every day Sondra befriend and walk home with children of color in the community. So your mom was basically a person of, I don't know what we would call her, an activist of her own, in her own way. So Sondra carries on these traditions of activism and just sort of fighting for what's right. On the international stage, she's the founder and coordinator of the Darfur Task Force, and her support of Sudanese dissidents has, out of necessity, been somewhat disguised, but it's an important area of her activism. So she has really been involved with actually giving shelter and intellectual homes to people coming from the Sudan, fleeing the Sudan, who are activists, and she's been very, very supportive of efforts in the Sudan in terms of all forms of activism. So Sondra is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, and in addition to many teaching awards that she's received in various California institutions, she received the Fair and Open Academic Environment Award, popularly known as the Diversity Award at UCLA, and she's been honored in a variety of ways in various UCLA departments. Twice she's been given an award for courage from the community of California State University, Long Beach, a Vesta Award for the Los Angeles Women's Building of Scholarship on the Arts, and numerous other awards for her service. And in 2011, Sondra received two of her favorite awards. First was a Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award from our Association of Middle East Women's Studies, and then from the Salma Women's Center, Resource Center in Khartoum, Sudan, she received an award called In Recognition and Appreciation of Her 50 Years of Commitment and Valuable Contributions in Support of the Sudanese Women's Movement. At the beginning of this year, our journal, JMUS, published a special volume, Volume 10, Number 1, entitled Scholar, Mentor, Activist, Sondra Hale's Transnational Feminist Commitments. It is a beautiful special issue put together by mostly students and some colleagues with wonderful contributions, not only about Sudan, but just the many areas of gender scholarship that Sondra has influenced others to do. And I see some of the authors here. Raise your hand. We have Ellen Gruenbaum and Anita Fabos, and Susan Slimovich couldn't be here, and Khanum and Aza couldn't be here, but many people who love and work with Sondra participated in that beautiful special issue, so look for it. Although Sondra is technically retired as of November 1st, 2011, she was almost immediately recalled to offer a graduate seminar at UCLA and to co-direct the Center for Near Eastern Studies, which she did for a while. She continues to carry out fieldwork in Sudan, where she spent several weeks this spring in Khartoum and working in Sudan, and to work on a number of writing projects until she decides to stop, and her friends say this will never happen. And she's not going to retire, basically. Sondra's going to be active. You're going to keep going forever, I believe.
Until I'm drooling and they haul me away.
Anyway, so she's a remarkable person. She's an icon of feminist scholarship in the region of the Middle East and in Africa, and she's also just a great, supportive person, very sagacious, very wise. She's a person you can go to tell her your intellectual and academic woes, and she's a great person. We need to have women mentors like this in our academic and scholarly lives, and so I think we all really are grateful to you for that, Sondra. And so with this, I'd like to give the stage to Professor Sondra Hale of UCLA. Her distinguished lecture of 2014 is entitled The New Middle East Insurrections and Other Subversions of the Modernist Frame. Sondra.
I can't possibly live up to that introduction, of course, which I did not write, I am quick to say. Marcia did her homework. She read several documents, I think. Thank you, Marcia, for that wonderful introduction. And I also want to thank the sponsoring organizations, JMUS and AMUS, and the Council on Middle East Studies here at Yale, and the Macmillan Center for Area Studies here at Yale. They've been very generous with me, and I've been very well treated. I want to thank the staff that made the trip and stay so comfortable so far. I'm not especially comfortable this moment, but I have been quite comfortable. I want to thank Laura and Amar, and then when I come to Bonnie, Rose, and Marcia, I don't know where to begin. Bonnie Rose is just the bestest managing editor on the face of the earth. And I've enjoyed not only working with her academically and professionally, but she's just been so kind and wonderful to me, a really fantastic collegial person. Marcia has been giving all the kudos to me and a couple of other people in the room for JMUS, but we really have an enormous debt to pay to Marcia because she was our very first editor. Without her, JMUS might not have made it. You know how difficult it is to start new journals. And so Marcia just took it and ran for the first 2 years and built the reputation. And Nancy Gallagher, who's somewhere here in the audience, and I took it then and that was at Michigan, and then we took the journal to UCLA for 4 years. And then Marcia rescued us again, bringing the journal back to Yale for 4 years. So really, Marcia, too much praise being given to too many other places, and I really, really want to thank you. Good friend also. But that's not why I'm saying that. No, friendship has nothing to do with it. For more than a decade, I've been thinking about several themes or topics that at first seemed disparate. But then I began to realize that they were tangentially related. Maybe that's what you do when you just can't get things straight in your head and you're wondering, how you can come up with any coherence. But at any rate, for the last 3 years in particular, coinciding with the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, and by the way, I use italics all the way through for various words, but I'm not going to do my little thing every time. But since the beginning of the Arab Spring, and also since the secession of South Sudan from Sudan, in other words, 2011, I've been trying to put these themes together, or questions too, not just themes. First, in observing the political behavior of participants in contemporary uprisings, such as the anarcho-tinged revolt in Seattle, Washington in 1999 against the International Monetary Fund. Since then, I began to ask how useful the modernist frame is for those of us working on and for revolution, and to ask the same question as Hamid Dabashi in his book, The Arab Spring. Quote, to what extent is the notion of revolution appropriate in reading the current uprisings in the Arab world? And do these revolutions perhaps posit and purpose a new language for reading them that accords to them the primacy of authoring their own meaning? End of quote. As an addendum, I ask how useful those grand narratives of emancipation, such as Marxism and feminism, are, I being both a Marxist and a feminist. How relevant are other elements of the Enlightenment, such as the unity of reason, the unified subject, order and coherence, the reliance on science and technology, and the stress on social and economic progress? In light of most postmodernist thinkers' dismissal of and disdain for the concept of revolution, I began to note a paradox, that elements of postmodernist thinking and performance can be detected in the contemporary insurrections, and yet would we call them postmodernist movements? An oxymoron in postmodern parlance. I've tried to make sense of this. Simultaneously, I've been working on knowledge production, especially trans-knowledge, feminist knowledge production, and relating it to what I've called migrating epistemologies. Then I began to realize that one of the ingredients of some of these uprisings is attempts to dismantle the old regimes of knowledge, suggesting that the journey of migrating epistemologies within transnational feminisms, for example, is unsettled. All along this journey, I began to leave a great deal of space in my thinking for what Malcolm Gladwell refers to as the gift of uncertainty. Relatedly, I grew to question the concept of failure, as it's generally applied to development projects and social movements, and as some have applied the term to the new insurrections. I began to see failure, and that definitely is in italics throughout. I began to see failure as being a queer art, to use Judith Halberstam's expression, and as often having unintended consequences. It is these unintended consequences to which I devote an important aspect of my paper. However, one last variable has graced my journey, a revisiting of my past studies of public space, especially feminist use of public space. Here I've also relied on Manuel Castells, who, in his analysis of the contemporary insurrections, uses public space and cyberspace as reference. And I've also relied on a number of recent post-Arab Spring writers who've stressed public space or have gendered that public space. Merup, for example, has some articles, the latest Merup. This is, however, the least developed idea in the paper, so I ran out of space, time, and everything else, and wasn't able to do much with public space. So maybe some of you can help push me along in that area. Well, let me give us some notes on postmodernism and postcolonialism as I understand them, just so we're on the same general page. I'm reviewing some of the ideas of these late 20th and early 21st century conditions so that we can keep in our minds some of the characteristics of the new insurrections. So as we talk about postmodernism, I'd like you to think about the insurrections that you've been following. And by the way, we might want to discuss these terms we've been using. I will go back and forth between uprising, insurrection. I only use revolution when I'm in italics, and some other terminologies that we might think are even more appropriate. Pauline Rosenau says postmodernism haunts social science today, as well as, and I would add, as well as haunting or stalking our attempts to analyze the new insurrections within a modernist framework. Rosenau has reminded us that postmodernist ideas challenge the global, all-encompassing worldviews, reducing Marxism and feminism and liberal democracy, etc., to the same order, and she dismisses them all as logocentric, transcendental, totalizing meta-narratives. Whoa, what a condemnation. Logocentric, transcendental, totalizing meta-narratives that anticipate all questions and provide predetermined answers. Therefore, modernist social movements, mainly based on identity, unity, and a central truth with a capital T, have no legitimacy. Besides, they're thought to be teleological, suggesting a moral end. Alain Touraine and others argue that, quote, modernity is no longer a force for liberation. It is rather a source of subjugation, oppression, and repression. The postmodernist goal is to delegitimate all master codes. Some postmodernist theorists, like Bowman, even invite us to be comfortable in the absence of certainty and explanation, and to accept the new philosophical relativism. Some offer renewed relevance to the traditional, the sacred, the particular, and the irrational. Touraine, for example. In fact, according to Rosenau, citing Gerald Graff, all that modernity has set aside or rejected has taken on renewed importance in postmodernist thinking. Emotions, feelings, intuition, reflection, speculation, personal experience, custom, metaphysics, tradition, cosmology, myth, magic, religious sentiment, and mystical experience. Well, that sounds like a feminist soap opera. But these are all elements that those of us in the social sciences who were trained, at least initially, in positivism, were told to absolutely eliminate from our research. The fact that some of those have crept back into our research is no doubt a positive. Rousseau claims that postmodernists offer indeterminacy rather than determinism, relativism rather than objectivity, diversity rather than unity, difference rather than synthesis, complexity rather than simplification, and look to the unique rather than to the general. Furthermore, not only is there no central truth, but the idea of centering man with a capital M has been undermined. In fact, there's no unitary subject, no universalism, and fragmentation is preferred to totalization, all of which means that truth gives way to tentativeness, amounting to the demolition of most of the ideas from the Enlightenment, including the notion of reason. Relevant to our topic of the new insurrections are the substitutes that postmodernists and postcolonial thinkers have slotted in as their chosen qualities of social life. For example, playfulness, word games, performativity, and creativity. A trickier term to deal with is postcolonialism, and I'm wondering if I want to skip this whole section on postcolonialism, in which I remind us of what we're bringing in from not just Edward Said's Orientalism, but discourse theory in general. I mean, Said used Foucault, Homi Bhabha used Althusser and Lacan, Spivak used Derrida, etc. And just to remind us about some of these postmodernist thinkers, postcolonial thinkers, and also to remind us that there's a great deal of stress on language as dominant, as dominating, and as colonial discourse, and what colonial discourse means, and so on. And this whole idea of dismantling the old regimes of knowledge that we're seeing in the new insurrections strike me as examples of a negation of mimicry, although ambivalence is very much a part of what we're seeing. I have not worked out this area of postcolonial thought and the insurrections. I'm still working on it. Also, a part that I'm skipping is this other milestone in postcolonial thought, which is the subaltern theorists. But as I said, I'm going to run out of time if I deal with them. I think most people in the room have read Homi Bhabha, or many people at least. As a general statement, we could say that postcolonial studies is the process of interrogating the center from the margin using deconstruction. But how useful are these ideas in looking at the new insurrections? Well, let me talk about the feminisms and our discontents, plural, both of them, plural. Because the amalgam of postmodernism, postcolonialism, and transnational feminisms has for some time offered us ideas that are open, contingent, overlapping, fluid, diverse, differentiated, and ambiguous, it seems fitting to mention here some of the ideas within transnational feminisms, in addition to gesturing towards the new insurrections as a source for some of our more recent ideas and actions. In considering political behavior, the amalgam I just mentioned, quite an amalgam, by the way. I mean, to throw postmodernism, postcolonialism, transnational feminism, and so on, all together as if it's one thing with which you're going to move forward is a bit foolhardy, but, give me a chance. In considering political behavior, the amalgam I just mentioned has had a profound effect on my thinking. In general, I'm influenced by post-1980s feminisms and critical race theories, meaning, among other approaches, I try not to essentialize or totalize anything. You probably catch me in that. I'm also becoming less exact and less explicit and leaving space for the plurals. Likewise, it's too limiting as a method or a thought to spell things out completely, to define them too closely, or to try to fix them in space or time or approach. Although many feminisms come out of modernism or have been a part of modernity, I think that it's important to subvert the rigidity of modernism that may categorize feminism as a unitary system. Instead, it seems more useful and relevant to interpret phenomena as not closed, definite, or finite, and not rigidly defined or categorized. Slippery stuff. I also try to avoid the pitfalls of naturalizing categories, concepts, or subjects. For example, I don't deal with identities as identity per se, but as critical perspectives, ways of looking at the world critically from a particular perspective. That is, ways of analyzing it as we are perceiving. So being a Latina or a Sudanese then is not so much an identity, even though it may get expressed that way, as it is a critical perspective, or viewing a film as a queer spectator. Perhaps most importantly, with regard to the feminisms, I'm convinced that a theory or a critical perspective actually insists on or generates a practice or praxis. Here's where the feminisms offer a challenge to many of the postmodernist precepts I've laid out, which would appear, on the surface anyway, not to insist on a practice. However, there remains the problem of how to put our less than finite and flexible notions into practice. In Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity, which probably most of you have read, Chandra Mohanty calls for us to recognize and put into practice a new ethics, a rethinking of self and community through the practice of emancipatory education, a rethinking of the workings of power and strategies of resistance in both grassroots movements and academic institutions. Finally, she calls for theorizing and practicing an anti-capitalist and democratic critique in education and through collective struggles. Ella Shohat, in Talking Visions, Multicultural Feminism in a Transnational Age, suggests we try to practice multicultural feminisms. That, when I first read that, it made my head spin. Couldn't imagine it, practicing multicultural feminisms. And then she says, quote, not in the simple, additive sense of many histories and geographies, but as a political and cultural project which mobilizes the polycentric relationality of a constantly changing world, end of quote, and I would add a transnational world. Many aspects of postmodernist thought may give us pause with regard to the relationship to the feminisms. In general, the feminisms don't fit neatly into either modernism or postmodernism. That is the kinds of feminisms that I generally think about, partially because there are elements of both, and there are contradictions, and there are dialectical processes and imbrications that subvert aspects of various feminisms. For example, I hope I'm not putting you to sleep with these abstractions. I get to much more grounded ideas in a moment. In about 85 pages, I'll reach the more concrete, let's put it that way. For example, some postmodernist and postcolonial thinkers call for a refocusing on that which has been taken for granted, has been neglected, forgotten, considered irrational, I'm into one of those lists again, has been seen as insignificant or repressed, has been deemed borderline, the sacred, traditional, eccentric, sublimated, rejected, non-essential, marginal, excluded, tenuous, silenced, accidental. It's great fun to dwell in all of those. Certainly many feminist scholars have rescued and reinstated and resuscitated many of these ideas and methods. I think we were way ahead in that regard. For example, for some decades, many feminist scholars have focused on the esoteria, minutiae, and ordinariness of life. For example, diary recordings, genealogies recorded in a family Bible, messages and symbols sewn into a quilt, etc. Nothing is too insignificant when trying to reconstruct a life or a subjectivity, a voice, which is a term we'll problematize in a moment. There are other relevant themes in transnational, postcolonial, multicultural feminisms that should be familiar to many. First, we try to disrupt conventional dichotomies such as oppressor and oppressed. All concepts are subject to deconstruction, reevaluation, subversion, and intervention. 3, we use language to unsettle, but we also try to unsettle language. 4, furthermore, we can no longer assume a simple voice, in italics, that is, minimal units of self-definition. According to Shohat, quote, multicultural feminism avoids the twin pitfalls of an atomized fracturing of units of the local, on whose behalf I truly speak on the one hand, and a diffuse, all-embracing cosmopolitan internationalism, which speaks for all of us, on the other hand. One way to shed some light on the ways in which we can see the feminisms within the prism of postmodernism and postcolonialism is to discuss transnational feminisms. In fairly recent years, which I'm not going to do a great deal, by the way, which is why I took it out of the original title. In fairly recent years, we've begun to analyze the movement of bodies, goods, and ideas across national boundaries, such that strict distinctions among nations become altered or more flexible. Such movement, hybridity, and ambiguity create an unsettled environment for identity politics. Casting aside identity politics has opened the door for the kinds of collective actions we've seen since 1999, and more strikingly since 2011. I have entitled this next section, Uncertainty in the New Uprisings. Aha, we're getting to the point. These postmodernist and postcolonial ideas have had the effect of unsettling many of my ideas and causing me to reevaluate aspects of my research area, the Middle East and Africa, specifically Sudan. In my studies of women's and people's movements over several decades, I had always worked within a modernist mode. I didn't see how we could work in any other way. I claimed that postmodernist ideas do not lead us to liberation, nationalism in the case of some postcolonial thought perhaps, but not liberation. Even many approaches to transnational feminisms did not seem to leave room for emancipatory practice. For example, the really wonderful pioneering book by Grauwell and Kaplan. And we feminists and others have had a very limited definition of what it means to be revolutionary. Scholars of women's movements have defined a movement as contrasted to rebellions, riots, spontaneous and collective actions, etc., have defined movement in particular ways that place movement as very much a part of modernity. For example, Janet Chavitz and Gary Dworkin, in a book called Female Revolts, lay out conditions for particular political actions to be considered a women's movement. They insist that there has to be a span of years, that there has to be a large number of supporters, that there has to be a network of organizations, and there has to be a unifying theme, and there has to be leadership. I believed all that. In other words, these are movements which are also hierarchical. This fairly commonly received conception of a movement or a women's movement simply doesn't fit what we're seeing today in most of the new insurrections. Because I've always worked within a modernist frame, I had to theorize that revolution can happen only if we have a clear agenda that is agreed on by all of us, only if we're unified, even if it's just a loose coalition of groups, and only if we mobilize, make demands, and deny failure. We had to be firmly and unflinchingly committed to the cause. Failure was not possible, a much expressed slogan in our modernist movements. Failure is not possible. However, thanks to a number of recent authors, most coming from fields different from my own, I've been given the gift of doubt, and that comes from Malcolm Gladwell in a New Yorker article, one of those times when you say, aha, leading me to look at the contemporary insurrections, the Middle East, Africa, gender politics, and the world in a very different light. I'm referring to the anarcho-tendencies and direct democracy actions that we're seeing in some of the collective actions of the last decade or so. For example, to name them again, the anti-capitalist, anarcho-tinged revolt against the WTA in Seattle, various environmental green movements, the Occupy movements, Sudan's Garifna, which means we're fed up, boy are we, Egypt's Kafaya, meaning enough, movement, Spain's Indignados or Indignadas, indignant ones. Iceland's kitchenware revolution, the Arab Spring insurrections of Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, the actions emanating from Taksim Square, Gezi Park, and Istanbul, and in various squares in Greater Khartoum, Sudan. I use only some of these examples to discuss the use of experimental strategies and new formations and associations, which I see as manifestations of postmodern or postcolonial and feminist strategies. It seems an appropriate place to say that when I thought of the term distinguished lecture, it's a little daunting, but then I thought, this is an experimental paper. Is one so foolish as to give an experimental paper and call it a distinguished, or have it called a distinguished lecture? Well, anyway, here we go. I've argued elsewhere that despite the rejection and dismissal of modernist social movements by many postmodernist and postcolonial thinkers, I was going to use pomo poco, and it was because it was a distinguished lecture that I didn't feel I could say pomo poco. So there we go. The dismissal of modernist social movements by many pomo and poco thinkers, we can see tendencies in recent political actions that indicate that political actors, including some transnational feminists in the vanguard, are doing a whole new politics that does not mimic the characteristics of modernity. They are anti-statism, anti-authority, and opposed to hierarchical organization. They are all searching for new and freer forms of association that have already had and will continue to have a profound effect on gender dynamics. That at least half of these new insurrections are taking place in the Middle East and North Africa raises a number of other interesting questions, mainly about our assumptions, even among us MENA specialists. I mentioned that most of these insurrections undermine conventional ways of acting in, quote, revolutionary movements. Not only are different language forms and nonverbal behaviors, such as hand signals, used, but a number of the contemporary actions can be characterized as having a playful and creative aspect to them, often in the form of performance. And I just think about what it was like in the 60s when I was trying to find a home for my Marxism, attending various leftist parties, but the Communist Party in particular was stultifying, humorless, unbelievably boring. And as were most of the parties that I visited during my independent Marxist period. I'm still an independent Marxist. Sudan's political and bigender collective, Garifna, for example, used flash demonstrations and guerrilla theater, occupying public space and exiting before the authorities could reach them, raising consciousness on the run, so to speak. Likewise, Egypt's Kafaya used sarcastic and biting humor in their public performance of opposition to politics as usual. We can see the humor even in the names that they've chosen for their organizations. I mean, instead of, the Communist Party of Sudan, we get "We Are Fed Up," and in the case of Egypt, "Enough," not to mention the humorous graffiti slogans in Egypt. It's not only language that's being creative, but also the choices of public and private places and spaces on which these words or phrases are placed. I love Karima Khalil's edited compilation that was published by AUC called Messages from Tahrir, Signs from Egypt's Revolution, published in 2011. This volume presents a number of illustrations. For example, people have used their bodies for political self-expression. I don't mean this is the first time this has ever been done, but it's been done more frequently in these new insurrections. For example, a message from Mubarak and his regime, quote, "You will leave by the hands of the youth," written on the hands of the youth. Just, an enormous amount of cleverness and sarcasm and so on. Or car license plates with the command "leave" on them. Or a barcode with Mubarak and an expiry date. or a kite flying that says "Leave Mubarak" on it, or intentionally misspelling Mubarak's name on a makeshift sign. The slogans have been sometimes hilarious with that famous Egyptian sarcasm. For example, quote, "I'm desperate. It's been almost a week since I've had tear gas." The performances have been innovative. For example, a man dressed in a football referee outfit, holding a whistle in his mouth and a red card saying, "Mubarak out." In general, the use of different language to describe one's political opposition is indicative of the current youth movements. It's difficult to move into an era of free association if one is using old language and old visual symbols suggestive of old structures. As we know, various forms of feminism have also experimented with new language, as have some schools of thought within postmodernism and postcolonialism. The sense of humor is so in contrast to the political parties of modernity. The notion of over-serious commentary and oppositional political actions has been superseded by humor and playfulness. Even though people are getting arrested and killed in some instances and so on, humor has pretty much prevailed. Some of you can maybe correct me on what's going on in some of these places now. Manuel Castells refers us to Iceland's kitchenware revolution, which followed the 2008 economic meltdown. The populist public displays were named kitchenware, in other words, were named for pots and pans were used to express outrage and also to be inclusive of everyone. The noisy and messy pots and pans performance not only could rally people, but symbolized the common people and common and everyday activities. Human dignity would seem to be a major theme performed in these current insurrections, thereby not only personalizing the political activity, but encouraging self-reflexivity, in many cases also referencing gender dynamics. Diane Singerman, for example, in a recent article in JMUS, discusses the importance of dignity in the Egyptian uprising with special reference to women. In Spain, the Indignadas is a self-reflexive movement that stresses process over product, reminiscent of the feminisms. That was one of the slogans that I heard in early 1970s feminism in the United States. The process was more important than the product. Castells describes the shared terms of discourse in the Indignados movement. Some of the terms and principles that the Indignados used were self-management of community, a nonlinear process of decision-making, a respect for all ideas, and that meant no voting. I mean, that one is just really very striking. To think of voting as not respecting other people's opinions was head-spinning for me, really. A futureless condition, in other words, the right now is stressed. No bosses, non-representational, so direct democracy. You don't do it through a representative. Nonviolence, decommodification, they didn't use any money. Creativity and slowness, we'll get there wherever there is. There may not be any there, but we'll get there slowly. As for North America, one of the most successful insurrections of recent years is one that I experienced directly, the Occupy movement, beginning with the Occupy Wall Street movement originating in New York, but with its geographically widespread manifestations. It describes itself on its open source website as leaderless, nonviolent resistance movement that's highly diverse. Their website announces that we are the 99%, a slogan that became very contagious, as virtually everyone could identify with it. It's revealing that they also claim to be using the tactics of what they call the Revolutionary Arab Spring. So there's a lot of contagion in these movements. In most of the Occupy movements, decisions are made in the General Assembly, which Castells describes as horizontal, leaderless, and census-based open meeting. that uses hand signals partially as fun and self-expression, partially to replace technology. A paradox that I observed is that although much has been made of these political actions being internet and social media revolutions, a parallel stream is a rejection of technology and of the capitalism that propels it. This is an aspect of these movements that coincides with some postmodern, postcolonial ideas. And I haven't looked at these insurrections closely enough or long enough to be able to see if there is a big contradiction between the embracing of technology, the social media, and the rejection of technology. Maybe some of you can try to clarify that a bit. The Occupy movement developed into fragments, not branches or cells, but fragments. I found the Occupy UCLA movement a fragment of the larger movement. It was very highly diverse, with women playing a major role. It was self-reflexive and deeply mutually respectful again, with dignity being a respected mode of behavior. I found my colleagues in it more interested in building new forms of association than in making demands. In other words, enjoying being with each other and the processes that exist in such an environment. Castells discusses these no-demand movements that use slogans like "the process is the message." Now, these organizations, or disorganizations, which are primarily composed of youth and women, are not guided by a central truth by which people must abide. There's no unitary subject. In other words, there's the absence of a meta-narrative or master code. I also observed a high degree of uncertainty, which does not seem to perplex them, nor does not having a clear direction or a unity, certainly not a unity of ideology. From what I learned directly from the Occupy movement, participants seemed comfortable with the fragmentation and ambiguity that reigns. People did not seem to force the notion that they must stay together to eternity. These are open, contingent, overlapping, and fluid actions. I stood on the margins of one of the liveliest and most, in quotes, successful insurrections, in the sense that the spirit of the insurrection was building up while I was in a hotel overlooking Taksim Square in the heart of Istanbul, which, as we know, itself occupies an ambiguous location between Europe and Asia. Filled with daily, often political activity, I witnessed it in 2013 as a chaotic, fast-moving, modest square with a small park as a park, which became the center of an uprising to save it from development. All of you know the story. Because Taksim was already associated with daily demonstrations, social media was not such a necessary tool for congregating people. As the journalist remarked, quote, "Revolutions happen in the flesh. In Taksim, strangers have discovered one another, their common concerns and collective voice. The power of bodies coming together, at least for the moment, has produced a democratic moment," end of quote. Participants made very moving statements about the experience of being in the square. One woman participant remarked, "We found ourselves." In this undertaking, the protesters of Taksim Ghazi are engaging in a fluid, irregular, open, and unpredictable set of actions, manifesting postmodern and feminist ideals as a thorn in the side of Istanbul's modernity. The demonstrations morphed and spread out into other parks where families and others have been holding nightly or weekly forums. Again, not referring to themselves as a movement or giving themselves a name, but relaxing into the area of uncertainty. The participants in these insurrections also take pride in the decentralized and even fragmented nature of their permeable movements, making claims that, quote, "Taksim is everywhere," and using slogans such as "Occupy is everywhere." The messiness of the insurrections we've witnessed in the last few years have caused some to think of them as failures, in italics. Initially, I was unimpressed with the seeming direction of the uprisings, aligning my thinking more with the pessimists. But then I read this article in the New Yorker by Malcolm Gladwell entitled "The Gift of Doubt," not even remotely connected with the insurrections, and not the kind of reading I would ordinarily do. I must have been desperate that night. No No crime novel to read or mystery novel. Gladwell is reviewing a biography of a man named Hirschman, Albert Hirschman, who was an economist and urban planner. So Gladwell became kind of his proxy. And the two of them inadvertently offered me words to describe some of what I'd been thinking about the Arab Spring and Taksim, and would eventually think about the 2013 Sudanese uprising. In The Principle of the Hiding Hand, the name of an essay by Hirschman, he was drawn to the many ways in which plans did not turn out the way they're supposed to unintended consequences, and perverse outcomes, and the puzzling fact that the shortest line between 2 points is often a dead end. Hirschman was also keen to say that language itself is revealing, and in my view, as I said earlier, it's a part of what is so different about these new political actions. The next section of the paper I entitled The Concept of Failure and Its Unintended Consequences, Some Ideas from Greater Khartoum. I just came back from Khartoum on March 1st, so you can tell how well digested these ideas are. They're really new to me. I'm hoping that a couple of the Sudanists and one Sudanese in the audience will be able to shed some light on this. On November 7th, well, my first line doesn't have to do with Sudan, it has to do with Egypt. On November 7th, 2013, Ahmed Maher, one of the youth leaders of the April 6th segment of the Egyptian uprising, gave a talk at UCLA in which he referred to their uprising as a failure. And then he said, we'll just have to start all over again. At the time, I was startled that he could possibly think that their political actions had failed, when the whole world took notice and people were changed as a result of their actions. I mean, I knew what he meant, but I was rejecting this idea of failure. Here's where I return to one of my main points. Looking at Sudan's seeming false starts, the supposed scattering of the opposition and the like. I want to underscore the importance of uncertainty and making creative ventures out of mistakes or failures. This has been a turbulent time for Sudan. Someone probably needs to tell me how we're doing on time.
It was 2:20 or thereabouts, so we started at 1:30. You can keep going for 10, 15 minutes, something like that.
Okay. But what about my 85 pages?
Because we finished at 3:15, we just want to leave some time for
Sure.
discussion. You've got 50 minutes on it, so we're okay.
You mean if I just continue to talk, no one will challenge me and just use up the time? Okay. This has been a turbulent time for Sudan, a country so invisible to most of the world that experiments can take place and fail without having to be under the constant gaze of world opinion, as Egypt has been. Women can play major roles without the West, especially Western feminists, anointing them and patronizing them by commenting on their progress. Within the last 3 years, Sudan, the northern part of which often identified as Arab, lost a part of itself with the secession of African-identified South Sudan, and as one of many consequences, took an economic dive. Sudanese witnessed the government bombing the Nuba Mountains, composed of a series of non-Arab ethnic groups in the west-central part of the country. And people also experienced a massive flood in the capital area. Then in September 2013, people carried out bloody oppositional acts in an attempt to uproot the military Islamist government, or at least, and this is an important distinction, to unsettle it. Furthermore, in 2013, 2014, women were acting in an oppositional mode, and I discuss this in a moment. People were taking big chances, engaging in direct democratic actions and flirting with danger. Life could not have been less certain, and everyone I talked with mentioned being depressed because September had failed. Yet, these various failures had unintended consequences. Let me relate a few of them. I'm hoping some people might be able to add to them. In 2009, a local Sudanese representative of India's Barefoot College, Gada Kadoda, managed to persuade Indian and Sudanese authorities to include women from the remote and economically marginalized area of the Nuba Mountains in a project to train women as solar engineers. Quite a revolutionary thought. The women were given 6 months of training in India with the aim of electrifying villages in the Nuba Mountains and training others to do the same. The women who were selected had to be older so that the chances that they would leave their villages would be less, and they had to be uneducated, formally uneducated, so that their local education would not interfere in their absorbing the whole new experience of the Barefoot College. 4 Nuba women had their training and returned to hopeful celebrations. Shortly after, the first village in the Nuba Mountains was electrified, and it was really electrifying. However, in June 2011, before the next village could be electrified, the government bombed the Nuba Mountains and war began. The precious solar panels and installations were destroyed. The project had failed. 2 of the women fled to the capital, as many thousands did, and joined the ranks of the internally displaced persons. The situation was very difficult for these IDPs. They had no income, the children could not be schooled, and the environment and government were hostile. In 2012, Dr. Kadoda again persuaded the authorities to allow the women to return to India for further or follow-up training in the production of various goods, which they'd never done before, with the aim of adding to some of the skills they had developed in their first training in the Barefoot College, the making of candles, sanitary pads, chalk, paper bags, and toys. It was decided by a group of Nuba, with the help of Kadoda and others, that the women would develop an income-generated factory backstopped by a cooperative, which was officially registered in 2014. No minor task to get registered with the Sudanese government. All of these were enormous accomplishments. These were clearly unintended consequences of a war, the recuperation of women's abilities in the face of seeming failure. In 2013, Greater Khartoum experienced a massive flood that destroyed the humble dwellings of thousands of people. Perhaps a result of the abandonment of any welfare role of the government, youth resurrected the Sudanese social custom of the nafir, a call to mobilize, the tradition of volunteering during a crisis, which is still practiced in some of rural Sudan. This most recent example of nafir was a response to the 2013 flood crisis that resulted in the loss of many lives and, as I said, homes. Many youth I spoke with insisted this coming together materialized into a youth movement and is still expanding, ready to respond to any crisis and is being politicized. The Nafir had never been a political type organization. The emergence of a youth movement was another unintended consequence, this time of a flood. In general, the last few years, political actors, especially youth and women, have experienced a number of setbacks as the government, fearing rebellions over neoliberal and austerity measures put into effect as a response to the loss of oil revenue, became more repressive, closing newspapers, raiding NGO headquarters, closing centers on the left, arresting human rights activists, driving groups such as Garifna Underground and the like. Among the unanticipated consequences has been a process whereby groups have moved into different and creative modes of political expression. For example, while NGOs suffered considerable funding cutbacks over the last 2 years, some are making use of local resources to continue their activities. Also, as government security became increasingly stifling of angry protests, women and others began to respond with upbeat and optimistic semi-public performances. One example is the Khartoum Rising event that one can see on YouTube in February 2013, organized by Salma Women's Resource Center, an NGO, in collaboration with other civil society and youth groups. It was an example of a low-key yet far-reaching event. The organizers staged a happy dance of freedom by hundreds of young and older women at Yale University for women, It was videotaped and sent viral on the YouTube. The association of the words rising and spring did not go unnoticed. Perhaps a quiet announcement of Sudan's entry into the insurrections of contemporary times, but certainly an unintended consequence of the increased repression. The following year, 2014, while I was there, the same organizations organized a larger event, this one called 1 Billion Rising Against Violence Against Women, that grew in numbers of participants, demonstrated bolder activities, and expanded into other cities. The event I attended was held at Affad University for Women, a private university venue but with public exposure. It was filled with security people. In September 2013, a series of large demonstrations were carried out, consisting of representatives of many groups, but not led by any group in particular, and certainly not led by the old political parties, so this was a big change. I don't mean they weren't participating, but they weren't leading it. The composition was decidedly young, with a large proportion of women. These events were held in public spaces, 2 main squares, one in Khartoum, Huria, Freedom Square, and one in Khartoum North. My interviews in Khartoum after the September 2013 demonstrations and overlapping into October among youth reveals several ambivalent and ambiguous attitudes. A number have said that the demonstrations had failed, meaning failed to overthrow the government. And yet some of the same people admitted that the demonstrations were not necessarily aimed at overthrowing the government, but that they just wanted to make their voices heard. In my group interview with 4 members of Garifna, they agreed among themselves that the demonstrations were held precipitously and that the people should have laid the groundwork. That was a fairly common criticism. I brought up the idea of false consciousness, using that very carefully, about failure. And they agreed that the political liveliness and defiance that is, in quotes, in the air in Greater Khartoum would point to a raised consciousness about the political future. My experience in my nearly 2 months in Khartoum, January through February of this year, was that people were far more creative in their thinking than I had ever experienced in Sudan, and more defiant. Yes, Sudan had 2 civilian overthrows of military governments in 1964 and 1985, true. But those were so very different, so qualitatively different from what one could see in 2013. So on the one hand, they could say that they were very depressed over the failure of September. On the other hand, they were willing to make dangerous statements in public settings, all the while knowing that security agents were ubiquitous. This was a major change in the public persona from all of my previous visits since 2004, an unintended consequence of failure, I would posit. Greater Khartoum may not be experiencing an Arab Spring, although that metaphor was evoked frequently across the spectra of those I interviewed, but many of the same processes are taking place that we see elsewhere. Women and youth, in their fragmented and diverse, anarchic, democratic, leaderless, and creative groupings, are forging a whole new set of ways to come together to experiment for the future, or even not for the future. One young woman remarked to me that the authoritarian Islamist military government of Omar Bashir, quote, could stay in power. I don't care. I will just go on doing what I'm doing here on the ground, working to change things, change everything about this life that we're being forced to lead, end of quote. Another woman demonstrator, wearing a tightly wrapped hijab, gestured towards her friend sitting a few seats away. The friend was dressed in tight jeans and top, with no head covering. The first woman remarked that the 2 of them, who had not known each other before, had been arrested together during the demonstrations and had become friends in jail. Nothing like jail to get people together. She remarked that she realized that a demonstration would not end the tyranny of the state. Instead, she claimed that what the demonstrations highlighted for her was that they had to start with their own families and raise consciousness about women and patriarchy. Both women said they'd never attended a demonstration before and that being arrested changed their consciousness. Most of the women in the room who were discussing events with me had not attended a demonstration before September 2013, but said they were all aroused politically after the events and vowed to work on change at a grassroots level. Perhaps some of these processes don't seem like unintended consequences. We all know that demonstrations can raise consciousness. But what has impressed me about the September events is that people are still talking about them. But they're moving into different territory with their thoughts. Women in particular are now focusing more on gender dynamics, convinced of the need for change there first and then move on. Let me conclude as quickly as I can. Short conclusion. In the introduction, I quoted Hamid Dabashi's question: to what extent is the notion of revolution appropriate in reading the current uprisings in the Arab world? For many, especially members of established oppositional political parties, revolution was their aim. But for most of the young participants, the goals included doing a whole new politics that does not mimic the characteristics of modernity. To repeat what I said above, these participants in the uprisings have in common a belief that their political actions are anti-statism, anti-authority, and opposed to hierarchical organization. They're all searching for new and freer forms of association that have already had and will continue to have an effect on gender dynamics. If missteps, delays, and miscalculations can eventually propel someone or something into forms of success, or at least unintended consequences, then we should look at these more closely. Also, we Western or Western-trained observers often want to see change come quickly, when some of the current insurrections, for example, have heralded slowness as a virtue. We also tend to want to see a wholeness or a total revolution, as do some of the participants. We're far too quick to deem something a failure because people do not agree on one course of action, do not have a clear ideology, and are fragmented and inconsistent. Or Egyptians lament that, yes, they overthrew a dictator, but failed to change the entire oligarchic, patriarchal, authoritarian regime. We're seeing the fits and starts of a messy series of events, but the fact that many of the participants continue to be self-reflexive and subversive seems highly important for now, a building block, if you will. In discussing the queer art of failure, Judith Halberstam points to, quote, a basic desire to live life otherwise, a quest to articulate an alternative vision of life, love, and labor, and to put such a vision into practice. Through manifestos, a range of political tactics, and new technologies of representation, radical utopians continue to search for different ways of being in the world and being in relation to one another, end of quote. Halberstam asks what kinds of reward failure can offer us. Using ideas from Barbara Ehrenreich's Bright-Sided, Halberstam notes that although failure comes accompanied by a host of negative affects, such as disappointment, disillusionment, and despair, it also provides an opportunity to use these negative effects to poke holes in the toxic passivity of contemporary life. Halberstam also points to some of the ideas of James Scott's Seeing Like a State, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed. She uses his ideas to express a favorable view of borrowing from European anarchist thought more practical forms of knowledge that he calls metis, and that emphasize mutuality, collectivity, plasticity, diversity, and adaptability. She uses failure as a form of unbeing and unbecoming, giving us a new relationship to knowledge, or subverting the regimes of knowledge. In analyzing the Arab Spring, Dabashi has opted for the idea of open-ended revolutions and work in progress. With regard to Sudanese activists who are clearly engaged in a work in progress, one that is fluid, contingent, irregular, open, unpredictable, and uncertain, please stand up and be counted. Thank you.
That was amazing, and such a hopeful ending too, about the fact that these really aren't failures. These are just, in a way, the beginning of a new, period of unexpected things to come. We can't tell what the future holds, but hopefully, as you said, people are striving for better lives and better things to come. So we do have time for some questions and thoughts and comments, and I guess I will call on people. And can you say who you are and where you're from? Yeah, let's hand the mic.
Luke CUNY, New York. I would like to know if I can ask a question that's not related to your talk.
I don't know.
I would like to know if you have a position in regard to the debate or the controversy in France regarding the teaching for gender in public schools.
Well, of course I have a position, and that is that we should be teaching gender in public schools. Did you have something?
You've been working extensively in Egypt, in the Middle East, in Sudan, and knowing that this controversy started with not only with the extreme right, especially with the Christian conservatives, but mainly with the conservative Muslims in France. So I'd like to know if you have any position or any explanations. I know it's not related.
Can we talk afterwards? Okay.
Comments or questions?
Maybe he's not a gentleman. We don't know yet.
I hope I am a gentleman.
Okay.
Yes, Yusuf Gürsey. I'm originally from Turkey, actually, and I'm Turkish, and I've been actually following the protests that are still going on in Turkey. Thank you very much for. But my question is about the Arab world. I don't see all of the protests as homogeneous, and in particular in some countries, the protests have been taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood or other tendencies, which, I'm a Muslim too, but I have problems with their approach, and many of my compatriots, women and both from the Arab world and from Turkey, have some problem with some of their approach to women in their interpretation of Islam. Could you please comment on that?
Comment on?
Well, I don't see all of the...
absolutely, they're not. I mean, I treated them too homogeneously, and there are certainly differences among the various movements. You notice I didn't mention Libya very much. And certainly things are uncertain, uncertain in Egypt. And you said something about women.
Well,
everything is unresolved.
Some of them have led to the proliferation of the conservative Muslim Islamic tendency,
sure.
And this has adversely affected women.
Sure, that would happen. I mean, I would imagine that we're going to see many variations before we see anything that we can clearly define. I mean, it is such an open book and so unresolved that I would be really foolish to make some prognosis or whatever. I mean, I think it was almost a foregone conclusion that the Brotherhood would come to power. And I'm surprised that hasn't happened more clearly in Libya than it has. And surprised that it started to happen and didn't happen in Tunisia, although that's still a little touchy. Certainly we can't talk about all these insurrections as one thing, but I'm just trying to point to the elements that we can see that are different from what we've seen before, and how that will pan out in terms of gender relations also remains to be seen. I mean, one of the papers this morning stressed the sexual assaults in Egypt, but that might be a minority set of events. So I'm not sure that we should think of these revolutions, or these insurrections as necessarily bringing out sexual assault against women. Or we might think that in our patriarchal world in general, that these kinds of mass coming together of people where there's anger involved and so on might result in assaults against women. So I don't want to think of the exceptionalism of Egypt along these lines. By the way, I'm a master of not answering questions directly. I don't really mean to do that, but I realize I have that tendency.
This is not a direct question. No. Well, Fatima Sadiqi, I belong to the University of Fez, Morocco, but I'm also a Fulbright, currently Fulbright at the University of, what is it called? Cal Poly Pomona in California. I listened to every word you said. Really fascinated me. I admire your courage to try and encapsulate all that theoretically. Maybe a lot of people in our part of the world in different disciplines and from different perspectives understand that maybe it's too early. But people who think about these things cannot wait. You have to think about these things. You mentioned a lot of things at the beginning, and which I understand, and you did more than that. You tried to actually, everything you said at the beginning, you tried to link to whatever you observed. My question is, well, these things happened spontaneously for some, and we understood later on that things led to other things. Do you think that maybe the theoretical dilemmas will sort themselves out later on?
No.
No. You said you don't answer directly.
Okay, then.
Yeah.
Let me change my wording.
Yeah.
Maybe no.
Maybe no. Okay. That's indirect enough. Yeah, but I'm also interested in these things. So do you think that these things, that was my first query, will simply change, or don't you think that the movements themselves change? Not that they are heterogeneous. In addition to being heterogeneous, you start with one thing and you end up with other things. We had a milder Arab Spring in Morocco, but a lot of things came from it. So I just want your take on this.
No, I was thinking of Marcuse and the continuing revolution. And even though Marcuse was, writing in an entirely different framework, a Marxist framework, but a kind of neo-Marxist framework, nonetheless, that expression had, stayed in our language, and I think to some extent that's what we're seeing now. Even though we're hesitant to use this word revolution, but maybe we can use it loosely and say that as Debashi said, this is a work in progress. This is a continuing revolution. And that's how I view it. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see all of these areas go through many different stages. I mean, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood could come to power again and so on. And probably not. I mean, probably we're going to see what we saw in Algeria, the sort of suppression of the Brotherhood, and then constant tension and an unresolved situation because of it. That would be my guess.
Very quickly, but what's the impact of that on theory itself? Because theories are what they are. They also change.
Yeah, they are what they are, and they also change, and I suppose it is changing our theories. I mean, that's what I was basically talking about, that we do have to look at these things differently, and that it's, as you said earlier, it's probably too soon to be able to say very definite things about theoretically. But we can, Hi.
My name is Hanan Dagour. I'm a professor in Ibn Zohr University in Morocco. In fact, the point that you have raised about the slowness of change, I mean, it raised a lot of questions in my mind. Since I'm dealing also with the question of the quota system in Morocco, the quota system, so these are some measures that are implemented in Morocco, and these are kind of top-down. And I'm just asking the question, what kind of changes are we looking for? Because these, when we look at change and it comes too slow, it's not enough. But when we look at other types of changes in the region also, and they come too abruptly and too fast, then it's not okay also, which is something, because I'm going to discuss this also, because it's a problem. What kind of changes are we looking at this region? How can we reach the good results of having human rights and having women's rights in particular fulfilled in a satisfying way, if we can say? Thank you.
Well, I suppose it depends on what region we're talking about, what region within the region. I guess it depends on what level of change we're talking about. I mean, you said top to bottom, whatever, what kind of change. And so I don't think I can, maybe you can, but I don't think I can make a sweeping statement. But I certainly do believe in whittling away at a grassroots level. I mean, when I look at the world and get depressed about, say, the U.S. ruining Iraq and little things like that, I want to crawl under the bed. And I do crawl under the bed, and I stay there for a day or two. And then I remind myself that I only have to do something, wake up that morning and do something little. And that's what keeps me alive and keeps me moving. Is just this idea that sometimes we just have to whittle away, do little grassroots. Grassroots is not always little, but work at a grassroots level, and that is slow. But it seems to me that if there's a lot of grassroots activity, as there is in Sudan right now, that people are may not be paying attention when actually something very big is happening. And that's, so you've got, sort of simultaneous things in a sense, the potential, at least, for great change. Yes.
Western, you want to have a look at the whole picture, the notion of wholeness. Mm-hmm. What I say, recently in Morocco we have political representation of women. If we look at the percentage, maybe we can say it's okay. We have the picture. The picture is great. Is parfait, as we say, perfect. But if we look at the details, then we are going to see that the picture is not, it's just fabricated. And that is the problem of change. What kind of changes are we looking for? When it comes too slow, it's problematic. But also when it comes with intervention, with specific measures, it's also too problematic.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Some thoughts from the Sudanists in the group, too.
Hi, my name is Nil Uzun, sociology PhD student at Rutgers. I'm from Turkey, and I agree with most of the things that you just said and conceptualized about all these movements, all the fluidity, uncertainty, performativity, like postmodern notions of, let's say, all these like fluid dynamic ideas. But the part that I'm a little bit suspicious is that when the Gezi movements happened in Turkey, everybody was, let me use the term, romanticizing this almost new politics and saying that, oh, we found each other. And, oh, like we found this new mode of doing politics together. It was so interesting for us. But then again, there was this all historical movements of feminism, revolutionary students movement, and left-wing organizations, and they were saying that we were already here. And this is actually how you know about, let's say, using lemon on your eyes for tear gas, because tear gas was first used in the mid-90s for student movements that were mobilized by revolutionary, let's say, fractions of left parties. And also considering the fact that the majority of the people who died during this protest were from Alawite neighborhoods, mostly, once again, mobilized by revolutionary left fractions. So my question is that how can we incorporate this notion into this post-colonial understanding, as if almost saying that this, let's say, traditional Marxist movements, traditional feminist movements were not almost as not there, but now we have this new mode. Because I think this new mode of doing politics might be only valid for certain class and certain groups of people, let's say. So in that sense, my question is that how would you incorporate this idea that these kind of changes and movements might already be built on previous modernist frameworks?
Yeah, that's a really, really fine statement. And I think a valid criticism of the paper. And I would sum it up to some extent to say that the paper is ahistorical. And that, no, thanks, that helps me a lot because, I mean, I'm someone who, there was a paper earlier this morning, and I can't remember whose, I'm sorry, but where we talked about, someone asked about trade unions. And I know that Joel Bainan has made a very strong statement about how it was really the trade unions that made the difference in Egypt. If the trade unions hadn't come in, the toppling of Mubarak would not have happened, at least at that moment. And that we have not paid enough credence to these previous movements and ideas and that sort of thing. So I think you're quite right in your correction of not romanticizing and not going too far with this notion of the new ingredients, a new way of. But what I'm hoping is that these will be ideas that will be inserted into, let's say, broader movements. Because I'm not a postmodernist. I may have sounded like it. But I'm not. I just like to play with the ideas because I think we've been closed for too long. The Marxists have been, Marxist parties at least have been pretty closed, pretty stultifying, which is a word I used earlier. And I'm just trying to, I gave this a variation of this paper in Sudan to a mainly communist audience, which was I considered it to be a severe critique of the Communist Party. And they did not miss the fact that it was a severe critique. The men objected to some of the ideas. The women embraced them, which was very interesting to me. I think women saw it as some of these ideas as creating more openings for them. And so we might want to look at that too, but thanks. And I really liked your paper this morning. The arty part of me.
Hi, my name is Neda, and I'm from the University of Southern California. And you just said that your paper was ahistorical, but if I was wondering, given that Egypt saturates the media and has historically, and given Egypt's relationship with the Sudan, was there a special relationship between Egypt and the Sudan? From my research in Egypt, a lot of it was from Tunis, and it was crossed regionally, but is there a specific relationship because of the history between Egypt and Sudan that,
Well, there is a close history, yes, and especially with regard to the communist movement, for example. But, Amina, what do you think about the relationship now?
Islamic fundamentalism in Sudan originated in Egypt, right? Through the work of Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna. Those are the leaders of the Islamic fanatic groups, and they really went back to Sudan and they established the Islamic regime in Sudan. Also, the Communist Party started in Egypt at the same time with Henry Corel, the leader of the person who established the Sudanese Communist Party and the Egyptian Communist Party. So there are a relationship between the two. And even now in the politics of the Communist Party of Sudan and the other traditional political parties in Sudan, they do have these different views, conflicting views on Egypt. Unity with Egypt or against the Egyptian because of the historical, the history of Egypt as they call it an occupier when they were together with the British and the Turkish occupying Sudan. So I think the relationship is really strong. Even right now, the only regime that really stand with Morsi is the Sudanese regime. Yeah. They hosted all the old ministers are visiting Sudan last week and the week before. They were there. They have the military camps there in Sudan, helping the Islamists in Egypt to topple the military rule there. So I think it's really, they're working together all the time. We always thought that the intelligence in Sudan is Egyptian. We never thought that they are Sudanese. So they have some kind of relationship, yes.
Thank you. And I think that the constant reference to the Arab Spring that I was hearing tells us that even though they may not be enacting necessarily some of the tactics, that they're thinking about it, and that that if we believe in contagion theory, certainly it was part of the spark of 2013. Would you agree, Amina? Or Ellen, or Anita.
There's a couple more questions. Do you want to say something? Okay. I will later.
I'm Smadar Lavi. I'm with the Middle East Studies Center in Berkeley, and I'm also the co-founder of Israel's Feminist of Color movement, or Ahoti, or Ukhti in Arabic. And because of my political work in the years I was locked up in Israel, I started thinking about the moment when agency becomes impossible. Your paper was very hopeful on the whole. And I'm coming at it from a point of view not only of activists, my kind, but also scholars who work in the discipline of world anthropologies. One of the critique of world anthropologies is that there is a certain US-European grip over the production of theory. And one of the US-European grip over the production of theoretical knowledge. And one of the key themes, particularly in American anthropology, because we always like to help the little guy, is the whole notion of agency, even docile agency, a la Saba Mahmoud. Then the theory comes from here, it travels to places in the global south, it oftentimes superimposes itself. There is engagement with global south intellectuals, but when it comes to who do you quote as far as making theoretical progress, it would be maybe people who migrated from the global south to the US Eurocenter to produce that kind of theory, or people who are being cherry-picked from the global south. Let's take, for example, Achille Mbembe and the way that he's been canonized, and how many others have not been canonized, say, to the University of Chicago, and then from the University of Chicago to get a legitimate cachet of having it be like a global south theorist, but it always gets filtered through the US-European production machine. People say like Junji Koizumi or Susanna Narodsky are very critical of the model of agency. They think it's very benevolent. Partially it's because even with postmodernist incoherence, it tries to create incoherent coherence of theory that is then being imported to the cosmopolitan scholars in the third world who write for academic journals here. And part of this critique of agency is when it clashes against bureaucracy. I've been following the Egyptian revolution, insurrection from the point of view of the Sinai Bedouin. I've been working there for 40 years and I still have active research. most of their life is spent against a monolithic, non-polysemic Egyptian bureaucracy that governs their life, and therefore they have their own Islamist, or they call it the Bedouin Intifada. However, for many people, all of these notions of movement, mobility, just to move to another town is too costly. And I wonder how much of it is our own do-gooder radicalism and optimism and romance that is being imported there, and how much there is an engagement with theories that emanate, not in English, from locals in the global south, most of which are not dealing so much with multiplicities, but they're still very linear because systems of regime, particularly these kind of authoritarian regimes, are very monolithic still.
Was there a question in there, Smardar? By the way, I'm a recovering anthropologist. I just want to put that out there. Can you want to ask me a question in a sentence?
The question is about what happens when we can no longer work with agency. What happens to our optimism as scholars and as scholar activists? What happens in this moment when scholars who work not in English and they're not in dialogue with the major journals in our discipline slap us on our face and say, you always want to help the little guy. We have other theoretical issues that we write about that you don't read and don't engage with.
Well, certainly. What you bring up is so highly complex that I don't even know where to start to respond to it, except to appeal to us to be more self-reflexive, to be more self-critical about what we're doing, and about what I've called migrating epistemologies. I've written about that. The same kind of circular it wasn't circular exactly, but let me use that word for now, circular process that you described so articulately. I don't know what we do about it in the way in which you've asked the question, except to be aware of exactly what you said about about the realization that things on the ground, that the Bedouin are not going to be using postmodernist ideas, and I don't mean to be humorous here, are not using postmodernist ideas, and that we're in the clouds in terms of the way in which we're sending ideas back and forth. I thoroughly agree with you about the way in which we anoint Global South scholars when they have embraced the ideas that they got from the West, and then they come to the West and they become these saints like Mbembe. But I don't know what to say about it at this point. I don't know how to concretize and how to play a role, as you say, what happens to agency in this kind of situation. But I'm not going to let you depress me.
Thank you so much. My name is Ilyas Bozgaya, a PhD student from University of Fes. I would like first to thank you for your great and valuable lecture.
Thank you.
I think I would like to join Madame Sadiqi in her inquiry about the theoretical frameworks. The problem is that we have to ask maybe at this point to what extent the current theoretical frameworks and paradigms that we are using now.
I'm sorry, I'm missing a word. Discursive frameworks, is that what you said?
Discursive
Paradigms.
paradigms.
Sorry, okay.
Theoretical that we are using now to analyze and describe and anticipate the events that are going on in the Arab Spring, the Arab world. To what extent they are successful in really making a valid description and analysis and anticipation of the event. And at this time, we have also to ask: are these discursive theoretical frameworks, are they open to other paradigms? For example, the Islamic paradigm. And here, I would like to bring about the idea of gender equality. So, how can gender equality be understood within the Western theoretical framework or in the Islamic framework? I mean, when we talk about equality within the family, how can we understand it? We understand it from the United Nations conventions and in comparison or in contrast with the Islamic paradigm. So can we make an openness, or we can illustrate on that?
Well, I think you cautioned and you added a good point. I'm not sure that it requires a response from me. I would hope that if I've presented a paradigm, which I don't think I have, I was a little bit too cagey to do that. But if I've presented a paradigm, then I'd like to think that it's a paradigm that's open to Islamic ideas, for example.
Thank you, Sondra, for your distinguished lecture. I found a couple of things that you said really very interesting to take home with me. I mean, I haven't seen the happy dance at Afad on YouTube yet. I'll go look for that. But the quotation of someone saying, "I don't even care if the government stays in power, so what? I'll just go about doing what I'm doing." I think that's really the big inspiration for us in a lot of different movements, is to see, and including Occupy and some of the others that you've seen, where people are changing the discourse in pop culture and spreading it through social media and other means. I'm just thinking of how rapidly generational change actually happens. We don't think of change as being so rapid because our lifetimes are really short. But it's breathtakingly fast what's happened in the last 200 years of human history. It's breathtakingly fast what's happened in our lifetimes. And so I just really feel like these ideas of designing or intending or planning a certain kind of change or having a model for how revolution has to happen and, oops, it didn't go that way, so we failed. I think that's probably our very limited horizon of what we're looking at. Huge changes have happened. I mean, just look what happened with in the United States with gay marriage, in Uganda with gay issues. I mean, things happen really quickly, and we don't necessarily see them coming, and they don't stop where they are because they provoke backlashes, and then something else happens. And I just feel that our understanding of change hasn't been sufficiently dialectical, and I think you've raised some ways in which it is definitely very, very complex and interesting. And I've always admired the way you end everything with questions. You never give us a conclusion or guidance. That's what I've always admired about you.
I have no answers.
That's right. None of us do. And so that's why I feel like you've provoked a very nice question for us, and you probably have many more to go. So thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you.
Well, I see we have 2 more minutes before our coffee break. So is there one last thought or comment for Sondra and her distinguished lecture?
Maybe she can provoke us.
Yeah, maybe. Do you have anything that you'd like? Anybody want to say one more pressing thing? Or Sondra, maybe you have some final thoughts now?
No, just I thought that there were some very good comments that I'll have to think about.
Yeah, it was a really thought-provoking, compelling, distinguished lecture. I'm so glad that you're our distinguished lecturer this year, Sondra.
If I hear that term one more
very
time.
Distinguished. It was very distinguished. Anyway, why don't we thank Sondra again and then take a coffee break, okay?